PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors about Pennsylvania history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk with Jason Cherry about his book, William Trent, Factor of Ambition.
This week on PA Books, Jason Cherry, author of William Trent, Factor of Ambition.
Jason Cherry is the author of William Trent, Factor of Ambition. Jason, how did you discover William Trent?
Well, it's funny. Growing up here, we were always, my parents were both history buffs and everything. And my dad was really into the Civil War and the American Revolution, being both were teachers. And it basically started with my parents both randomly going to an event locally. I'm from, Western Pennsylvania, and there were a few festivals, fall festivals and such. And there was one called the Penn's Colony Festival that featured arts and crafts and different things, but also had a living history unit there. One such unit, an artist by the name of Fred Trefall actually set up near my mother and grandmother, who had actually a spice booth set up there at this festival. And he was a member. He said, "Oh yeah, I'm part of this living history group. It's called Captain William Trent's Company." My mom was sort of intrigued, told my dad. They went up and talked to some of the members, said they were Pittsburgh based. We're like, hey, from Butler, we're not that far. And, what kind of events do you do other than, the one out at that time? It was out in Prospect, Pennsylvania, out at Lutherland. They were like, what other events you do? Yeah, we do 15, 20 events a year, depending on the schedule and what's available. And my parents were like, yeah. So they went to a meeting and got really interested. And then at that point, it was, they officially joined. And at that time, I was 10 years old when they joined back in 1990 there. And it sort of got us, my mother ended up making a lot of the clothes for us as kids, my brother and I. And so as a family, we would do these certain events. And then eventually, as we would do more and more events as I was growing older, you'd have visitors and such, these certain sites coming up and saying, what group do you belong to? What do you portray? And I'd say Captain William Trent's Company. And then usually the first question was, who is William Trent? And, the more I would read about it and try to sort of prep myself as I got older here, realized that even in Western Pennsylvania, let alone the other events we do outside the state, we ended up, nobody really knew who William Trent was. And the more I researched, the more I was intrigued and realized what a fascinating, figure he was and all the things he would do over the course of his life. And that's basically what got the fire going. And even to this day, when I still do the living history over 30 years now.
What is it that you find interesting about William Trent?
I feel like in this, basically the latter half of the 18th century, he was involved in pretty much, there was a native council or a treaty or any type of thing relative to basically the natives. William Trent was involved, and he either be for the fur trade or basically just when they needed somebody to basically record the minutes, be the secretary or acting secretary for the native councils. Trent was who they called because he was he had great penmanship. He was amazing at keeping notes and everything. And he would always be that one. Even the superintendent of Indian Affairs at the time, Sir William Johnson, who was notorious throughout basically the colonies, not necessarily just New England and New York. He would hire at least two different large native councils and treaties. He would hire William Trent to record the minutes, being that it'd be a long treaty of, I think at one point, the Treaty of Stanwix that William Trent recorded there in the fall of 1768, the book itself, just on what happened at that treaty, was over 110 pages.
Now, his name does appear as others do, George Croghan and Conrad Weiser and Christopher Gist and Andrew Montour. These people seem to appear everywhere from the 1740s to the 1780s, 90s in this colonial period in Western Pennsylvania. William Trent does seem to be everywhere.
Yeah, like I said, and it's amazing to me. I felt even when I talk to visitors or even just at different lectures I give, how his travel. These guys you mentioned previously here, like Conrad Weiser and George Crone and all of them. They didn't just normally go if they were based out of Philadelphia or even Harrisburg area. They didn't go 5, 10 miles down the road. I mean, Trent himself was going from, he would say he conducted business or would send out furs to London from Philadelphia, but then he'd say, I'm making a travel to the Forks of the Ohio, or when Fort Pitt was built, he would say Pittsburgh. And Philadelphia to Pittsburgh isn't even close today, let alone back then in the 18th century, where there were little or no roads to follow, maybe one such road by the 1750s and even into the 1780s. So it was amazing that these guys, and I like to call Trent necessarily a fur trader, mainly because he's the one that sort of hired the traders out. So he was what I considered like him and George Crome were basically backcountry merchants. They were men that were hiring out they were sort of the in-between, the middleman between those traders that they were taking then these shipments or money that they would receive for these shipments, such as furs and blankets and such, and sending them to either the business, either in Philadelphia or in London itself. But it just amazed me, especially being that, he would be as far as, he would travel as far as Connecticut to New York, to Sir William Johnson's house there in middle of New York. And then he would travel, without a doubt, to Philadelphia, to Pittsburgh, back to Philadelphia, without a drop of a hat. I mean, he referenced it in a letter where he would say, I'm leaving Philadelphia for Fort Pitt. And he would, leave. And then, several days later, he'd arrive at Fort Pitt and then say, well, I'd come back. And at the time, several times, he wasn't even living in Philadelphia. He was living in like Carlisle area. So that was, the travel itself over that latter half of the 18th century was astounding.
So let's go back to the beginning for him. Where did he grow up?
So, based on a lot of the evidence, and which is what I tried to explain in this basically tell-all biography, it was always a controversy on whether or not was he born in Philadelphia, was he born in New Jersey, where, which was it? And based on the evidence and different things, all the research I did, because it spent a decade basically researching Trent's life, putting everything together. It was based on all the evidence that it looks like, based on he was probably at the time born in Trentstown, or would later be the capital of New Jersey, Trent, New Jersey, of course, named after his father, Judge William Trent, that would eventually settle upon, at the time it was 800 acres there in 1714, would have a house built by 1719, and then would be fully living in it by 1721. And that's when, based on my evidence that on William Trent's eventual apprenticeship there in Philadelphia, being that by law you had to be finished by the age of 21, and doing sort of the math and research that Trent would probably be born in the present day house that actually still resides there today. That was built there and finished by 1719, the William Trent House in Trenton, New Jersey, and that's where he would grow up, at least those teenage years until he began his apprenticeship in Philadelphia.
Talk more about his apprenticeship. What kind of apprenticeship was it? What would he have learned during that period?
So William Trent, especially, and it's funny, the connections, we always talk about it's always who you know. And with William Trent, especially, being that his father was not only a shipping merchant, started out in Philadelphia, eventually moving to Western Jersey. His mom was just as connected. Her grandfather, she was from her former name was the Coddington, Mary Coddington, and she was the granddaughter of the former governor of Rhode Island, William Coddington, and they've a famous cemetery up there in Newport, Rhode Island, and that's where his mother was born. So, and they were related. Her sister would eventually marry the Shippen family, a very wealthy name there in Philadelphia, and so that's where it all started. So when William Trent was out of age for his basically for his apprenticeship, she contacted her cousin, their Edward Shippen III, a wealthy merchant there, and partnered with James Logan there in Philadelphia. And William Trent would eventually learn under him, which would be a mercantile apprenticeship, being that Shippen was a merchant. And at that time, it even started basically he was trying to he founded the settlement of Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, but used that as basically a stoppage ground, basically the last stop to the frontier, to the Western country there, what we know today as Western Pennsylvania, and used that as the height of the fur trade was going on. So when Trent was learning then that mercantile apprenticeship, not only learning Latin, but arithmetic, but he was also learning that the fur trade was key if you were going to be a merchant and survive financially in the colonies. And I think that's what sort of introduced him basically to a world he saw uh, as basically endless opportunity.
Now, in 1744, there was a very significant treaty conference in Lancaster, and he participated in that as a young man. What was his role? Was that the first treaty that he was a part of?
Yeah, it was the first that he attended, not necessarily the first one that he actually sort of took notes or took the minutes or became the secretary for. He did attend basically, and it's based on the evidence that a lot of the gentlemen from Philadelphia, Shippen included, would attend this basically monumental treaty in 1744 in Lancaster. And it was at that time, even the same day as the treaty ended, William Trent would put his signature along with Edward Shippen for a land deed dealing with a parcel of land there in what was basically land in the Lancaster area. And that would be based on that, they, after the treaty had ended there, Trent and himself had basically wandered in there and settled basically a land deal where he signed his name at that time in 1744, where he was probably still working as a clerk for the Shippen and Logan firm that day. And so, as he was just being a participant, but not necessarily actually recording anything, it would be pretty much the last one that he would actually just sit and watch. After that, he would be in attendance and would be involved one way or another, would either be using his penmanship or conducting the treaty itself.
Now, that 1744 treaty conference was very significant and would contribute to events that would lead into the French and Indian War. Who were the participants, and what was the outcome of that treaty that would lead into some of these events?
So the big thing was for the Treaty of Lancaster was basically it was with the Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Cayuga, and at this time, it brought in everybody because it involved mostly Virginians, and this was, and like you said, it led into the French-Indian War because whatever happened at that treaty in 1744 also gave way to several land companies. Thomas Lee, who attended the treaty there, being that he was very prominent in the colony of Virginia, being that he was at the Treaty of Lancaster and helped basically settle that with the Six Nations that promised more land than they believed they received there apparently after that treaty, being that they would reference it several times as it leading up to the French-Indian War there in the 1750s. But Thomas Lee would eventually use that as inspiration to start, basically co-found with two of Washington's half-brothers there, Augustine and Lawrence Washington, form what would be known at the time, the Ohio Company, referencing the Ohio country, being the Ohio Valley and western Pennsylvania and present-day Ohio, West Virginia, and different things. And it gave way to basically all these, like I said, not only land companies, but also land deals using that area of the Forks of the Ohio, or what we know today is western Pennsylvania, and even into the state of Ohio and further down the Ohio River. It basically opened the gates to basically everybody that either attended the treaty or heard of it, had basically money, would use that basically as a platform to hopefully provide opportunity that they could eventually settlements, knowing that at least they believed they had more land that they received from the Six Nations there at that Treaty of Lancaster.
Trent would eventually go into business with a man named George Crowan out on the frontier, centered in the area around Harrisburg. Who was George Crowan, and what kind of business were they involved in?
So George Crowan, even known today, a lot of historians call him King of the Traders because he came, as early as when this sort of area of western Pennsylvania and even into Ohio was basically uncharted frontier and wilderness. George Crowan came as early as the 1730s. It was known, at least according to Trent in one of the documents, Crowan actually had a trading house as early as 1738 at the mouth of the Cayuga River, which would be today the present-day city of Cleveland, Ohio. And it would be after that would fail when the French and the natives would sort of drive Crowan out. He would head back to Shippensburg and basically know what was his next step, hopefully getting more supplies and shipments from a store run by Edward Shippen. But the store itself, was run by a young William Trent there in 1745. These two would meet, and it basically sparked a friendship that would last basically for the rest of their lives. And George Crowan, being with his reputation already by the time he met Trent there in 1745, became, like I said, this sort of duo, and then eventually, several other partnerships, either be on and off again, regardless of the fact, would have a reputation of being, the most influential, basically backcountry merchants and traders of the 18th century, past the latter half from the 1750s on. So it was definitely an opportunity for Trent to see this, basically what was west of Shippensburg. And it would be Crowan that would teach him that, because by almost 1748, 49, after they had basically come out and Trent had seen the Western country, even by, I think it was 1752, there wasn't an Indian town or place that had a trading house that wasn't affiliated with Trent and Crowan. And it's amazing at that time, by the 1750s, there wouldn't be a native town out there that didn't hear of those two or one of the other.
Now, Trent would also have a military career, and it would start during the War of Austrian Succession, or the King George's War. How did he become involved? How did he become a commissioned officer?
Well, and I think it's a matter of also sort of a little bit of nepotism, because when it came down to it, the governor there of Pennsylvania at the time had been actually renting or leasing out Trent's former house at the time. And Trent himself had been, living as early as 1746, living around the Carlisle, Harrisburg area, where George Crowan had also frequented there. And at that time, it would be, they would find out that both Trent and Crowan, being that they were so prominent with this, and that Pennsylvania was going to get involved with this King George's War, mainly because His Majesty across the water there was very basically operating and nervous and dangerously looking at French coming down from the lakes and coming into New England. They needed more participants than just New England. So when they hired basically with Pennsylvania there, it was basically an idea that we should commission out Pennsylvania units in His Majesty's name, independent companies paid by the king. And Trent's name would come up, being that he was associated with Crowan, being that he was influential with not only with the fur trade, but also he knew men. He would know men in Philadelphia, but also possibly that weren't even in Philadelphia, but outside the city. And that's where that came to be when they were recruiting, and they needed 100 men apiece for 4 companies that were going to be under His Majesty's name in Pennsylvania. Trent was the one that was offered such a commission, which he requested, meaning that, and it was referenced later in 1748, Richard Peters would reference it being that Trent was so seized with ambition, he felt this was what he had to do when he took this commission in 1746. And, and this began his, essentially his military career. And after that would be forever known as Captain Trent, at least till 1760s when he was promoted to major. But at that time, he would use that as basically a badge of honor, because you would see numerous letters after 1746, or even after he was out of service there in 1747, would always sign his name, Captain William Trent.
Now, he would end up serving in upstate New York at a very remote outpost called Fort Clinton. What was the experience there like, and was there fighting going on there?
Well, and it's, like I said, if there was anything, it's sort of similar to almost George Washington's experience, where they felt this ambitious need this was his step to being, possibly, maybe in society, a gentleman at this point. And similar to Washington, Trent found out firsthand, what the actual, aftermath of war would put a toll on you. And it was then by, serving up there, he realized the conditions. They talked about smallpox outbreak in Albany when they were stationed there at Fort Frederick. And then eventually when they would travel north to what would be known today as the Saratoga area and up to Fort Clinton, they had to actually build barracks for Trent's men that finally arrived from Pennsylvania, mainly because the fort was in terrible condition. There was sickness. The Massachusetts men couldn't even come because of a smallpox outbreak. And they need more room for these soldiers. They would build temporary barracks there. And it would be within almost a year, men would finally start to desert, mainly because the winter conditions, and that they hadn't even actually seen the French that they were forewarned about, invading into upstate New York. But it would be at that time, and in the spring of 1747, that William Trent would take a party out. You have to go north in order to go south, merely because of the floodplains and the swamp that had flooded outside the fort. And he was not within 5-10 miles outside the fort when he was actually a group of him and men were actually ambushed by French and Indians there in April of 1747. It would be at this point that Trent would write later, based on an account, that 6 men within the first 20 minutes of the battle were scalped in front of him. He lost at least 7 or 8 of these men. He lost supplies. Eventually, they were pinned back against the swamp until luckily Fort Clinton reinforcements would come. And Trent was able to, after even saying that they almost ran out of ammunition, to a point that they were able to fight their way out until reinforcements came. And it sort of changed him, because after that, it was not even probably several months later, their service ended there in the fall of 1747. He returned home by December there, and he tried to, remain back into the fur trading business, the mercantile business with George Crowan. But it basically it changed him, because I don't think he realized that as ambitious as he wanted to be with this, with the military career, I think it changed him after that ambush, and it really set forth on how he looked at the future there. Eventually here as 1748 came into play.
Now, he would also, one of his many roles on the frontier was serving as a justice of the peace in a new county, Cumberland County. And but part of that role was enforcing territorial restrictions on settling. Can you talk about that? There's a community called Burnt Cabins that's still named after events that happened during that time period.
Yeah, and it's a great area. I've been to the area at least 2 or 3 times. I actually speak sometimes at Fort Loudon when they do their market days, which is within a very close in vicinage there of Burnt Cabins. But it's amazing. I remember passing through it at least years ago, not realizing what the actual name was from, and realizing it had to do with when Trent's time there in the May of 1750, when him and several other district justices, George Crowan being one of them, and several other names that became namesakes. The Chambers brothers, Benjamin and Robert, were involved. They had a settlement called Falling Spring, eventually became Chambersburg. Numerous other men that were famous on this expedition that were justices of peace. And basically what they would do, they were called in because they had built temporary lodgings based on a treaty in 1749 for these areas of the Six Nations, saying that no settlers could go past the Blue Mountains there. That area there to settle. But of course, by 1750, most of the settlers had broken this treaty, or at least weren't aware of it, and began and refused to leave this land. And these temporary cabins and lodgings that they had built for these men of the Six Nations and their families were frequented by basically squatters of white settlers. And it was basically where Trent was hired then with the sheriff of Cumberland County to go in and arrest these basically trespassers and squatters of these lodgings. And it would be there west of Fanicksburg that there were about 11 cabins or so. They would eventually arrest these men frequenting it. But then they realized, well, even if they arrested them and evicted them and fined them from this cabin, the settlers would just go and eventually frequent this again, these cabins that were still built. So they had to send a message, especially with the Six Nations that had traveled with them, and eventually would meet in council with them after this was all done. And by doing so, they would end up burning the cabins to the ground. And then by 1758, those 11 cabins in that area west of Fanicksburg became known as burnt cabins. And as it's known, as you just said earlier, it's known that today. But it was basically a turning point, because you figure that was in 1750. And that was when settlers were trying to go west of the mountains there, trying to go into the Ohio country, the Western country. And it basically played a role highly that this was just the start of many things to come, and a foreshadowing of settlers, and then basically the outbreak of possession there of what we know as the Western country. And what we know today is the French and Indian War, and eventually globally the 7 Years' War.
Now, in the 1750s, Trent and Crowan would develop a very extensive trading network throughout the Ohio country. And can you describe that network and how extensive it was, as well as the role of Pickawillany to their operation?
Yeah. So while Trent was actually sort of returning back from his military career, George Crowan had gone what their goals were in the first place, and that was to expand west. basically go to those Indian towns that didn't have settlements, but set up a trading house, establish commerce with the local, basically the local nations that were there, and he would do so. And by the time Trent would, come back there from the military career by 1748, they would realize that this partnership, a dual partnership, wouldn't necessarily would be better if they had some kind of person also that could handle basically the books and the goods part of it. Well, they went into the frontier, so they hired basically a protege of Thomas Penn named Richard Hockley, who had a dry goods store in Philadelphia there, and they would eventually start a partnership in 1748 to almost 1752. And the problem with the dissolving of this partnership by 1752, Trent and Crowan had so many irons in the fire at this point, trying the networking with all the natives and the Indian towns. They weren't really handling their business side of the deal and coming back they were doing it for their own opportunities, their own enterprises, instead of what they were trying to do for this partnership that was formed. But at that point, by 1752, right around the height of when Pickawillany was burned by the French and Indians, Trent and Crowan, there were at least based on the evidence, there were at least 8 or 9 native towns, stretching from the middle of what we know today is modern day Pennsylvania to the forks of the Ohio, to down the Ohio River the whole way to into eastern Ohio and even western Ohio. They even had a trading house at Pickawillany that Crowan helped build by 1750. So their names and their stamp, I mean, they even had a trademark logo that said HTC from this partnership of Hockley, Trent, and Crowan, that would be stamped on the barrels and even on their letters. And there would be, like I said, there would not be an Indian town around that didn't have some sort of supplies with this stamp on it. And at one point, you figure that span of 4 years probably would have been one of the most powerful partnerships, at least in the mercantile area, that handled business west in the Western country.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Now, we talked earlier about the Treaty of Lancaster in 1744, and coming out of that, Virginians would create the Ohio Company, and they would covet some of the same territory around the forks of the Ohio and down the Ohio River that were being frequented by these Pennsylvania traders. So what were the relationships between the Pennsylvania traders and the Virginians?
And it's funny because at this point, I mean, being that everybody was sort of vying for this essential, areas of land that they saw opportunity for, originally, Trent would complain, him and George Crowan would complain, being that they were native from Cumberland County at the time, in the early 1750s. Both were residents of Cumberland County, but basically were probably never home. Unfortunately, they were always doing some kind of business, whether it be in in the Western country there, the forks of the Ohio, or even, like I said, as far west as Pickawillany, which would be present day Western Ohio. But they would complain about the Pennsylvania traders, the rival traders, and even when the outbreak, they would even complain when the Ohio Company came about, and they knew that there were certain traders that were in that area that they would run into, that were actually employees of this Ohio Company. It would be ironic because eventually, by 1752, after the dissolving of that partnership between Richard Hockley, Trent and Crowan would stay together basically as an on and off again partners. By 1752, after complaining about Pennsylvania traders and after complaining about employees of the Ohio Company, mostly Virginia guys, Trent would be the one that would end up joining the Ohio Company, seeing the opportunity that how big the Ohio Company was going to be at the height of basically the peak of the fur trade.
So as Trent and Crowan's traders were operating in the Ohio country, how did the French respond? The French claimed this territory for themselves, so how did they respond to these Pennsylvanians?
Well, at the time, in 1749, Commander Céloron would come through with a group of French, and they would basically, that would be their calling card to their claim to that land of the Ohio River Valley, knowing that they would go to basically every riverbank, every major mouth, or even trees that were in that mouth of a riverbank areas. They would not only, plates on the trees, but they would also bury them in lead plates, sort of marking their territory. Lead plates to mark that the French were here in the name of King Louis. And that would be at that time that it would, Crowan would actually be out there just soon after Céloron's men would be there. But that would lead to Saint Laurent also responding on the French side, realizing that such the influence that the English had, being that Crowan and Trent's name were all over that area of the what we know today as Western Ohio, Eastern Ohio, and by doing so, being that he eventually became governor of Detroit there, up the outpost there, it would lead to that attack on Pickawillinie he ordered because he knew English were way more influential on the natives there than the French could ever. Saint Laurent feared for his life several times in his journal when he went to Pickawillinie, when he went to several other things, knowing full well what men like Trent and Crow and even Conrad Weiser had done already, and how the natives, we go back to even Pickawillinie, the head chief there, Mamiskia, would basically fly a British flag when the French would come through. So it just shows you what kind of influence these English, basically backcountry merchants, traders had in that area, and so it played a role. And it was basically a collision of three worlds that was bound to happen sooner or later. Now, we talk about the first shots of the French Indian War later on there in 1754 with young George Washington, starting it in a skirmish there in the morning there in May of 1754. But we look back at that attack on Pickawillinie in 1752, and it was French and natives that came and attacked not only the Indians there, but also the English traders that were residing there at the time, trading. And some of them were employees of William Trent and George Crowan. So eventually, this was all bound to happen sooner or later. And I always look back at 1752 being the key. That attack on Pickawillinie, eventually was just furthered that collision of three worlds, being the French, English, and the native world. And it was soon to happen that it was all going to reach a head at one point, and and eventually it would there with the French Indian and then later the 7 Years' War.
Now, the Pickawillinie attack was pretty brutal. There was one particular Native American leader known as Old Britain. He did not have a very good ending. Tell his story.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, I said his sort of French name, that Mamiskia, but yeah, the English called him Old Britain, which once again, it showed the English influence. And Old Britain would eventually be, brought out saying that they were going to not harm him and different things. And he would come out, and this was witnessed by one of William Trent's employees. Thomas Burney would be a relative itinerant and employee of William Trent and George Crowan. And he would escape, not before hearing about and witnessing, basically, they would bring out Old Britain. It would eventually, but what ended up happening is they would eventually tie him up, burn him at the stake, and then eventually the natives, to sort of show their devouring his soul, would actually remove his heart and eat it. It was and it was an account that you hear. It's very brutal, but unfortunately, that was the way of the thing in everything in the 1750s. And like I said, it basically would be the aftermath of this attack and the burning and killing of Old Britain that William Trent would see about a month later. They would attack in June of 1752, and it would be when Trent was not realizing at the time he would be almost in present-day Eastern Ohio when he would get word of what happened at Pickawillinie. It would be then that he would see the aftermath, the burnt villages, the men and women murdered there due to this attack. And he realized that we were in a point there that it would not only influence the natives that were either on the English side or on the French side, but also the trade and commerce with them, because at that point, it was already a double-edged sword with who to trust and what loyalties there were, and this furthered the questionable activities, not only of the French, but what were the British going to do to respond?
Now, as the French were working to expel the English from this area, the control of the forks of the Ohio became one of the key geographic points. At what point did the English start thinking about building a fortified structure there?
So as early as 1750, believe it or not, George Crowan had pushed to hopefully get a settlement there, realizing the importance of such a region. And the natives that frequented the area, the Lenape, and even some of the Six Nations that went through here agreed with this sentiment, but unfortunately, seeing it with basically the Pennsylvania government, the Quaker government that was Quaker run, they sort of would not act upon this. And it would be later, after Trent would take over basically as the secretary or bookkeeper for in what they known as the factor for the Ohio Company, handling all the books and handling the expeditions. Um, did it finally, get to a point that Trent could arrange an expedition, and it would be to a point, and it did also help too that the current Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, um, not only did he sail when he came over being elected as Lieutenant Governor, he also sailed with Ohio Company supplies on his ship, and come to find out that he was also a would be a prominent member of the Ohio Company. So there was some motivation on there, not necessarily for Virginia, but also for the Ohio Company. It would be this influence, in addition to William Trent, that would lead to finally an expedition to build, uh, hopefully, the first English fort there at the Forks of the Ohio. Um, and it would be from Trent's basically influence that would lead to this, because as early as 1753, when Trent would visit the Six Nations there, at the basically 18 miles below the Forks of the Ohio at a native village called Logstown, um, he would talk with basically the main leader of the Six Nations, local leader named Half King, or what he called Tanarison. And Tanarison would tell him the Forks of the Ohio was key to basically with the Indians, and it's key to if the English wanted to settle and have an outpost there to protect their families, protect even the native families. And it would be the key there. Now, not necessarily the Forks of the Ohio wasn't even the initial spot. 3 miles down the river there, at the mouth of Chartiers Creek, was the original plan for the Ohio Company. But then, after further influence, it was Trent that basically tried to push for the Forks of the Ohio. And then when they realized basically it wasn't navigable to the supplies, the settlements to get to that area there, 3 miles down the Ohio, and it was easier at the Forks of the Ohio. It was then did it realize that this was the prime spot. And then by the winter there of 1754, William Trent would eventually send his men and employees out to not only build a shed or cache, sort of a supply depot on the way to the Forks of the Ohio there at the mouth of Redstone Creek, but eventually build what they were hoping to be the first English outpost in Ohio.
Now, you mentioned earlier that he would work for the Ohio Company, and he also would earn a commission from Virginia for a military unit out in that area too. Did he know George Washington? George Washington, of course, would be a young man would gain his early fame in this area, or infamous in this area for Fort Necessity and some of the other operations there. Did he come across George Washington?
Yeah, and I think the first time they would meet is when Christopher Gist and George Washington would return from Fort LaBeouf there in basically the fall and early winter of 1753. And as they would come to um, back through the mouth of the Wills Creek, where the North Branch of the Potomac River meets in what we know today as present day Cumberland, Maryland. William Trent was residing there, being that he was the factor for the Ohio Company. He lived just across the river from what would be downtown Cumberland, Maryland. At the time, it was Frederick County, Virginia. Today, it's Ridgely, West Virginia, just across the Blue Bridge there. That was where the Ohio Company headquarters were. It was in Virginia. And it would be there when Gist and Washington would come through. And it would be that Trent would actually hand a letter to George Washington, knowing that he was going back to Williamsburg to finish his journey and deliver the news of what he heard from the French commandant at Fort LaBeouf. It would be that he would meet there, and it would be also at the time that Gist would also see Trent sending out those 17 horses, as Washington would describe in his journal, heading to what he believed was the Forks of the Ohio for the Ohio Company. Now, at the time, they were only headed to the mouth of Redstone because he hadn't official orders yet. But their actual goal was to build at the Forks of the Ohio. But they would meet there. Eventually, they would sort of have a sort of butt heads after when the French would eventually come down the river and push what was left of Trent's men out from that outpost there at the Forks of the Ohio by the spring of 1754. George Washington wanted Trent's men, knowing the value of them and their influence, and knowing, as George Washington put it, knowing from Indian paths to and from the Forks of the Ohio, he wanted Trent's men to go with him. And Trent said, "That's fine, but go with what I paid them through the Ohio Company funds, the 2 shillings a day," which was actually 3 times the pay of what the Virginia Regiment soldiers were getting. And Washington refused to do that, knowing that it would cite mutiny among the men if he knew Trent's men were getting more than his actual soldiers. Eventually, Trent decided not to join and told his men not to do so either. And it would, to a point that Washington would complain to Governor Dinwiddie about, Trent refusing to join him and his negligence and different things, sort of a slander in his name. But eventually they would make up because after Trent would basically go back and try to get back the funds for funding this own expedition to the Forks of the Ohio using Ohio Company funds and not funds he got from the governor. He would sue Governor Dinwiddie, and he would sue him where he would win this trial in 1760. And one of his character witnesses, saying that he was a outstanding as far as bookkeeping and as a person, would be George Washington. So it seems at that point, at least by the end of the French Indian War, Trent and Washington were at least acquaintances again, and weren't at ends with each other.
Now, once the French Indian War breaks out, and especially after the disastrous Braddock campaign, what was life like out on the frontier? We're looking at places like whether it's Cumberland, Maryland, or in the Cumberland Valley of Pennsylvania. What was life like there?
So, it got to the point, by the time Braddock's army would come through there in 1755, Trent was he was still operating as the factor for the Ohio Company, still living in his house across from there, but there were more and more inhabitants there. The settlements, basically after what happened at Fort Necessity, and with the French sort of taking control of having Fort Duquesne built there and control of the Ohio Valley, the settlements were no longer safe, even in sort of eastern Pennsylvania. It opened up the frontier. There were more, native attacks. Trent would even write about several that happened not only near Wills Creek, but down by Patterson Creek and up by the, in the middle of basically the middle of modern day Pennsylvania there, by Penn's Creek and different things. So by the time General Braddock's army would come through, the land was sort of devoid of timber and everything. Even Trent said he used what last lumber he had in the area to provide for Braddock's army, citing out the temporary barracks he built for the men. He actually, in order to make any money, he high-priced his timber twice as much as what he would normally sell it for, just so he could make some money. Eventually, with the settlements not being, outside the fort being safe, he would eventually move to an actual, settlement by 1756, having basically his second child. His first would die in infancy. He would have a daughter born in 1756, and she was born in Lancaster, because at that point he would live in Lancaster from 1756 to 1760. Citing basically, he would still travel the frontier, but he realized that it was not safe for his family to be that far away from other inhabitants.
Now, one of the key diplomatic conferences during the French Indian War was the Treaty of Easton, and William Trent seemed to be everywhere. He was there too. What was his role there, and what was the treaty?
Yeah, so the 1757 Treaty of Easton sort of predates the second one that would be even more important in 1758. William Trent would come, and their deal was to try to get with the Lenapes, hopefully to get them to join their side at this point, because as we realize, the war has gone globally at this point. And at this time, war has officially been declared by 1756, and now it's not only basically in the colonies, but it's worldwide. It's 5 out of the 7 continents are fighting this now. And at this point, they're key to this, and at least the men that were backcountry merchants and traders knew that they wanted to basically, further this expansion, or at least settle peacefully, or at least, drive the French from the Ohio Valley. They needed the natives. And at this point, especially the Forks of the Ohio and the areas above, in the eastern Pennsylvania there, eastern especially, they needed the Lenape. They needed, Pennsylvania who attended. They needed everybody to be on the same side and not squabble with each other. And as influential 1757 as it ended up being, Easton really didn't, it didn't really, as much as he was there and he took the notes, he didn't actually really solve much. So by 1758, General Forbes had come in, hopefully trying to duplicate what General Braddock couldn't, and that's get to the Forks of the Ohio and drive the French from the Ohio Valley. But he had a different approach. At that point, using what they did accomplish from that treaty in 1757 at Easton, they could begin there from Carlisle on. It started in Philadelphia, but officially led to Carlisle, and then it would be from there. Basically every 20 or 30 miles, building an outpost to hopefully supply the last, so they could make their way out with a large army. At this point, General Forbes's army was almost 6,000 strong, and he was sort of at it to a point that even when he got to what was then known as Fort Raystown, eventually Bedford, it was considered the most second populated place in Pennsylvania outside of Philadelphia. so many men and families that were with the army. And it was very influential that eventually the Treaty of Easton, then in October of 1758, was the final nail of the Six Nations, and some of the Lenape were eventually that hadn't already gone to the French, were with the English now. That was what played the turning point of the war, as we headed into late 1758, and then the English finally taking over the forks of the Ohio again, reclaiming it, sort of bittersweet to Trent, who had lost it sort of 4 years earlier, and finally starting to establish what they'd set out to do, by the early 1750s.
You mentioned Brigadier General John Forbes and his campaign to recapture the forks of the Ohio. What was Trent's role in that campaign?
So originally, he was just sort of handling supplies and different things between the forts. But it basically, what was the turning point with Trent with the Forbes expedition in 1758. By late May of 1758, there were Pennsylvania and Virginians basically stationed at Fort Loudon, Pennsylvania. And it was a small outpost fort there, and it would be there that Trent was supplying supplies there from Shippensburg. He traveled with several of the Cherokee and other nations that had accompanied him about giving them supplies, so they headed home. And it was at this point trying to basically get their loyalties to join this and help their campaign there as they headed west with General Forbes' army. But being that he was sort of the acting quartermaster at this fort, giving the supplies out, it would be that night, it was a turning point. And there were several letters that were written to General Forbes that described that night where he arrived there. It was late, it was wet, it was rainy, and he just wanted to wait till the morning to give the supplies to the Indians. But the Indians didn't want to wait, and they wanted them right away. And they had already had some dismay with Colonel Bouquet, and also from what they've heard from General Forbes. So basically, Trent was sort of at an impasse. Does he give several of these supplies now, or will they go home in the morning and they probably won't look back and probably won't join the British Army or at least support them. So he decides that he was going to wait till morning, but the Indians decide to break into the supplies anyway. And they come in with tomahawks. It says Trent described them as they came in yelling. They came in with tomahawks. They broke into the bales, the supplies that he had brought. It would be then that Trent sort of let them. He wasn't going to try to basically push back or be anything with that. But unfortunately, the Virginians and the Pennsylvanians that were there wouldn't stand for it. And they actually drummed a motion to assemble. Those that were stationed in the fort got their muskets lined up like they were going to possibly wait for further orders, possibly shoot upon those that weren't listening to the orders. And as the Indians half of them were leaving with the supplies and half were still breaking into them or at least walking away and saying they were going home, Trent was the one that got in between them. He told the Virginians and the Pennsylvanians to go back to their barracks and nothing was going to happen, put away your arms. And after they did that, he told the natives, the Indians, to come back. They would get their supplies in the morning, which the Indians did, and they slept actually in what was basically the commissary. And it would be that Trent would write that night he'd never felt, and up to this point in 1758, he had experienced a lot. He survived an ambush, the Forks of the Ohio, several things that happened. And he said that night in June of 1758, he'd never felt a night of more anxiety in all his life, of waiting till the next morning, thinking that the natives would do exactly as they did the night before. But fortunately for Trent, they took the supplies, they went home, and it became the turning point because a lot of the several Cherokee would come in later as Colonel Bouquet would come to Fort Loudon, and then eventually they would join Forbes' army, and it would be Trent that would be eventually, because of as he was described as, he used such great frame of words with the Indians that nobody else could, as it was described, that Trent became the assistant superintendent of Indian affairs of basically the Western country on this expedition, assisting to Abraham Bosworth, and he would play an even bigger role, accompanying the army then the whole way to the Forks of the Ohio, and eventually when Forbes named it Pittsburgh, and eventually became the modern name of Pittsburgh.
Now, so much of William Trent's story is a frontier story, but after the French-Indian War, he would spend 6 years in London. Why did he go to London? What was he doing there?
So this all dates back even to the French and Indian. I mean, it was basically he wanted basically the to get back what he had lost, not only during the French and Indian War, but what he described as the late Indian War in 1763, or what we know today as Pontiac's Rebellion. And over this course, he wanted to just to repay all the debts. I mean, at some point, at least, it was based on, in modern day money, by 1760s, Trent or Crowan probably combined debts reached what we know today in the millions. And it would be to a point that he realized by getting these signatures, hopefully getting these debts back from the traders that lost all this, not only supplies, but land during the French and Indian War, during when the Indians there at Fort Pitt decided to lay assault to those and all the outposts along the lakes and rivers. He needed to get it back. And by doing so, he took what he could and getting it approved then at Fort Stanwix by the Six Nations, who laid it out that they could have, in order all the debts that they lost, they could basically resupply them and resupport them by saying we could pay you in land that would be around the forks of the Ohio and stretch almost to down into West Virginia and modern day Kentucky and Eastern Ohio and all that. So he went to London to get the final signature, getting approved by the Privy Council and His Majesty's signature, King George III. And it would be at that point from Fort Stanwix on, they used that then to be over there. But unfortunately, we're at this time in 1769 as he's in London. England had a lot of different things to worry about at this point, and as they drag their feet on trying to help basically charter a new colony there in the American colonies, there's unrest in New England, there's unrest in Philadelphia. The taxes are coming out every year, and they're just getting the wind of it being on the London side, not realizing what's happening too much in the colonies, knowing that there is unrest. And by doing so, when they're finally hearing of the news of what's happening, the Boston Tea Party, even the repercussions from the Stamp Act, later on by 1772, 73, England's basically dragging their feet because they have bigger things to worry about right now. And by 1775, even after getting the actual approval by His Majesty to charter a colony there in the colonies and return back, we reach at that point the outbreak of the first shots of the American Revolution. And if there was any possibility of this charter going into effect, it's going to be shelved because of this American Revolution.
Now, one of the proposed names for this new colony was Pittsylvania. How did that go over in London?
So, and that was the big thing right off the bat, being that they combined sort of Trent's American associates with the London associates. They realized they could combine, because if they had to charter a colony and get the king to basically sign in on this, they had to at least give some to these members over there. So there were even current members of Parliament, basically prominent bankers, Thomas Walpole being one of them. He was a former member of Parliament. He was even the president of the East India Trading Company in the 1750s. And it was to a point that they used that to combine. And this is what the nickname of the Grand Ohio Company became, because it was using guys that were formerly Ohio Company and merchants with these British associates. And so when they initially named it, they wanted to name it and influence anybody that wanted to buy into it. So they named it originally Pittsylvania for the former Prime Minister William Pitt, the elder. And using so, I mean, they said we know Pittsburgh already, that was named by 1758. And by using this was the initial name, and it lasted. I mean, as of by 1772, when it officially got approved by the Privy Council and had to move to the Solicitor General, Pennsylvania stayed for about a year, and then it became. They realized if they wanted even more influential, maybe not even necessarily Pennsylvania, Vandalia became the next name, being that it was, as Trent would write in 1773, that Vandalia gave way to and in honor of Queen Charlotte, the wife of King George III, because her ancestral background was based on Vandalia tribesmen that she was descendant upon that lived in northern Africa and southern Europe.
Now, he would return to Pennsylvania in the midst of this revolutionary crisis. How did he fit into that? Where did he stand on independence?
Well, and it's funny because he writes even he was taking a letter home, and he realizes the magnitude of everything that's going on, because he sails basically out of London. He sails on a ship called the Sally, but they would eventually stop in Portsmouth, and it would be Samuel Wharton would see him off. He wasn't returning with him. He would stay in London there with the rest of his associates to finalize the deal. And Trent would say in this letter, or at least Samuel Wharton would say in the letter he was carrying, that they spied a ship carrying Howe, Clinton, and Burgoyne heading to Boston. And they were just waiting for a favorable wind. And you realize when you look at this ship was the Cerberus. It was the ship that two of these generals, Clinton and Howe, would partake in the Battle of Breed's Hill, or what we know today as Bunker Hill, and would be lay siege to Boston there. And at that point, they knew something was up. They weren't sure exactly what was going on. And it wouldn't be till after they arrived in June of 1775 does Trent realize the magnitude. He smuggles letters and even the restraining acts of Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia there, of New Jersey too, to Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. And he gets off the ship and realizes the hostilities that have already broken out in New England. Lexington conquered, and then within a week or so, Bunker Hill happens. And now it's, at this point, we realize they're trying to sort of still reconcile with England. But, after Lexington conquered, after Bunker Hill, Trent's realizing this isn't necessarily the case. And now all of his partners that he had in this land company in Vandalia who bought shares, a lot of them are loyalists. They're loyal to the king. And the moment he arrives, he gets his loyalty questioned. Even is even accused of being a loyalist the moment he sets foot back in Pennsylvania. One of the Philadelphia papers actually writes that he bartered a deal with Lord North, the current prime minister, as of which he demanded a retraction and actually sort of went on an investigation to clear his name, in which he eventually, by 1778, would have to give a loyalty, basically declaration, saying that he was loyalty to the patriot cause because he was accused of being a loyalist and loyal to the king.
Well, we've been speaking with Jason Cherry. He is the author of William Trent, Factor of Ambition. Jason, thanks for talking with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.